Well, and you'd think the president would be focused on those people and those numbers, but he's actually focused on Republican lawmakers, chastising them for not sufficiently defending him in the escalating impeachment fight. During a cabinet meeting yesterday, he urged members of his party to get tougher and fight while pointing the finger at one of his most outspoken Republican critics, Senator Mitt Romney.
I think the Democrats are lousy politicians with lousy policy. They want open borders. They don't care about crime. They want sanctuary cities. They don't care about drugs. They don't care about almost anything. I think they're lousy politicians. But two things they have. They're vicious, and they stick together. They don't have Mitt Romney in their midst. They don't have people like that. The Republicans have to get tougher and fight. We have some that are great fighters, but they have to get tougher and fight because the Democrats are trying to hurt the Republican Party for the election.
All right, Mike Barnicle, by the way, before we talk about what he just said there, I have to correct two things that are just blatant lies. He says Democrats don't care about borders. They like open borders. I will remind Americans again, for those with ears to hear, understand this, that when Barack Obama left office, the number of illegal border crossings were at a 50-year low, a half-century low. I was playing T-ball in Doraville, Georgia, and Meridian, Mississippi, the last time border crossings were as low as they were when Barack Obama left office. So, open borders? Not quite. It's Donald Trump that has caused the crisis at the southern border and made it much worse. Same thing with crime. New York City, crime is lower now than it's been since the 1950s, before I was born. They have to just make up numbers because they don't have statistics to compare to how safe it was when Barack Obama left office. But, Mike, I want to talk about this loyalty issue. He's knocking Mitt Romney. I find it very interesting that senators are being a little more careful in not attacking Mitt Romney. Senators aren't rushing to Donald Trump's side. They don't know for the first time how this is going to play out. They're not so sure for the first time that Donald Trump can shoot a man on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. In fact, they're thinking, this guy may be going down. I'm going to protect my political career because Trump's not going to make it.
Yeah, you know, Joe, I mean, United States senators, members of Congress and the House, they go home and they speak to people. And what you find out, we were just talking about those poll numbers, correct? When you go home, when you walk around, when you talk to people, usually the basis for a poll or response to a poll is a knowledge, somewhat limited maybe, but of the presidency in total. The presidency in total now is, 3 years for Donald Trump. Except that is no longer how respondents to polls, potential voters, respond to him. They respond to his presidency. What did he do today? So it's tough to get an assessment, I think, from pollsters on people they poll because they're looking at a presidency that is so mercurial that he is liable to say something later this morning that will dominate the news for the entire day. He does it each and every day. So there's no real measurement of his progress as president other than what he does by the moment. It's a crazy, crazy presidency. I think Republican senators are going to be a dominant force in this election process because more and more of them. Listen, Joe, we all know that privately in the cloakroom, they speak very disparagingly of them.
They all do.
And if there was a secret ballot in the United States Senate, I think Trump would lose 90-10, maybe. He might not.
If there were if there were a secret ballot in the Senate this morning, Mike Pence would be president by noon.
Yeah.
It is that clear. They want Trump out. They want Mike Pence in. They want a return to conservative principles. They want a return to conservative issues.
They want one day where they're not asked a question they can't answer.
Yeah, they want to talk about policy instead of Donald Trump trying to loot the federal treasury to make hundreds of thousands of dollars on a Scottish resort or his Irish resort or his Miami bed bed-bug-ridden resort. They want to get
DORAL.
back to business, and Trump's recklessness won't allow them to do that, Mike.
I mean, do you think that there is a single United States senator, maybe there's a single one, I don't know, but do you think there's a single member of the United States Senate who would want their children or grandchildren to espouse the values that Donald Trump maintains each and every day in
Not
his
one
life?
of them.
Not one.
Not one of them. And, you know, just to talk about not only how he behaved yesterday, but the sleaziness.
Yeah.
The inside dealing. They talk about the swamp. This is the worst swamp activity. He is swamp man. He is swamp man for what he's been doing. You know what? He even defended his original decision to host the 2020 G7 summit of world leaders at his failing resort, his failing resort in Miami yesterday. And it's not just failing because all of the bed bugs, because people are suing him, because if you go to DORAL, you got to be worried about getting bed bugs the way you have to get, you get bitten up. Oof. That guy, did you see the picture of that guy? He had bed bugs bitten all over his back and up his neck. I know why the guy sued him. I feel like itching my hair right now. It's just creepy. But anyway, it's been going down for the past couple of years. Only like 1 out of 3 rooms, based on Washington Post reporting, is going to be occupied in these midsummer months. And yet he wanted to stuff money inside of his pockets and fill those rooms and get millions and millions of dollars of free publicity.
So, you know, the emoluments clause is in the Constitution.
It's in the Constitution.
And the president, of course, took a shot at the Constitution and blamed that for his abrupt reversal.
It would have been great. But the Democrats went crazy. Even though I would have done it free, saved the country a lot of money. Then they say, oh, but you'll get promotion. Who cares? You don't think I get enough promotion? I get more promotion than any human being that's ever lived. I don't think you people with this phony emoluments clause, and by the way, I would say that it's cost me anywhere from $2 to $5 billion to be president. And that's okay. Between what I lose and what I could have made, I would have made a fortune. If I just ran my business, I was doing it really well.
So the president talks about the phony emoluments clause. Well, actually, that clause appears in Article 1, Section 9. Are you ready, Donald? Of the United States Constitution. Phony? No, actually, our founding fathers wrote this. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. And John Meacham, this just proves again that the Trump presidency is a presidency that's been defined by incompetence, illiberalism, and also illiteracy. He is illiterate when it comes to civics. He is illiterate when it comes to American history. And yes, he proved again yesterday he is illiterate when it comes to the United States Constitution. Populism is one thing. So it is a trend that has been growing in Eastern and Central Europe. I would actually argue this morning that actually it's reached its high point already and is receding. And you can see that in local elections in Hungary, local elections in Poland, local elections across Europe. It's receding. That said, he has taken the idea of populism to the most extreme form in the world, to where it borders now on complete and total incompetency and illiteracy.
Yeah, it's actually an insult to populists that he has become its embodiment. Populism is about the flow of power, the possibilities of power from the hands of the few to the hands of the many. Trump's not a genuine populist. Andrew Jackson was a genuine populist in many ways. Huey Long, to some extent, was a genuine populist. Trump is like Joe McCarthy. Roy Cohn, their common attorney, proving you don't have to make this stuff up, God just provides these details, once said of McCarthy that he had bought anti-communism the way somebody might buy a car. It was a vehicle to get someplace. And that's what Trump's done. He traffics in our basest instincts. It's as much xenophobia, nativism, racism, extremism, isolationism as anything else. One of the mysteries of the age that will ultimately be solved is to what extent he has been acting consciously or deliberately at the behest of a foreign power even. And I use that word advisedly. He represents the Russian worldview in a way with far more clarity and consistency, actually, than he represents the American worldview. And that's just a clinical observation. The framers put that article in the Constitution because they feared moments like this. They thought they'd be dealing with it with somebody like Aaron Burr being bought off by the Prussians or something. And it took a while. It took 2.5 centuries. But it was a prescient moment. And it was prescient for this reason. The founders understood in a way that we aren't entirely conscious of, or we don't acknowledge as much, that we're sinful, fallen, frail, fallible. We're going to screw things up far more often than we get them right. The founders based the Constitution on the fact that our passions would need checking. And that bet on human nature, which in some ways was a bet against human nature, has been proven right.
So, John, first I want to congratulate you on getting the Prussians into the show this early in the morning.
Yeah,
well, good job by you.
I'm impressed.
Thank you. I knew Mika would like that.
Mika said leading into that soundbite where the president called the Constitution phony, or the Emoluments Clause phony, that he, quote, took a shot at the Constitution. You have to let that settle in for a minute. The president of the United States taking shots at the Constitution, but this is his pattern. I mean, he calls anything that doesn't turn out well for him phony, whether it's the press or the deep state, as he calls it, or Congress, the intelligence agencies. It has to be phony so that it cannot be valid if it's a criticism of him. We talk about the institutions in this country holding in the face of this administration. Yeah. This does look perhaps like another moment where it will hold.
It's my hope, our common prayer, I think, because for all of our faults, you know, we are the most durable, the longest lasting experiment in trying to run a democratic experiment in a pluralistic, complicated, disputatious country. And the bet has always been that that document that he part of which you referred to as phony the other day, is in many ways, for all of its failings, it was the embodiment, the manifestation of a really profound insight about human nature. Really two insights. One was that, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration, we were all created equal. We didn't apply that sentence fully then. We haven't applied it now. I understand that. But it put in process a story where liberty would ultimately move, again, from the few to the many. And the Constitution, which was really the operator's guide, right? The Declaration was our statement of aspiration. The Constitution, in more simplistic terms, was the user's guide for this country. And it has stood up, it has endured, because the system is a sound one. But let's not forget, character is destiny. It requires people, it requires congressmen and senators and, yes, presidents and judges to fulfill that document. And that's the great test we're facing.
You know, Willie, while John was talking about the Franco-Prussian War, I just scratched down a couple of notes here. You talked about the President of the United States taking shots at the Constitution, bragging about taking shots at the Constitution, calling the Constitution phony. This is very rich for me as time I grew up. Republicans would always carry a Constitution. They would pull it out and they would thrust it at Democrats as if it were a shield or a sword. And I believe in this. This is what I mean, it was constant. We all carried around these constitutions, and we all shoved it in people's faces, telling them that we were more self-righteous than they were on the Constitution. Let me tell you where the Republican Party is on the Constitution right now, because you're right. Donald Trump bragged yesterday about taking a shot at the Constitution. He called the Constitution phony. He called the Emoluments Clause phony. This is the same guy who said that Article 2 gives me the power to do whatever I want.
Right.
This is the same guy who had Stephen Miller go on TV the first month of his presidency to say the president's power is unlimited and must not be questioned. And Donald Trump was thrilled with that performance. Also, Will, we've talked about it ourselves over the past 6 months. This is the same president that talked about when I took over the country.
Right.
When no president has ever said that. And also said when I took over the military. And of course, his argument then was when I took over the military, they didn't even have bullets. This is an illiberal, incompetent, illiterate president who poses, if you take him by his words, poses a direct threat to the Constitution of the United States. If you believe him, unless you think he's lying, unless you believe what he says is fake news, if you take him at his word, then his presidency is a direct threat to the Constitution of these United States that Republicans used to carry around in their pocket.
And by the way, all those examples you laid out, he believes all of those things. Those come from his heart. He really believes that. He talks about my generals. It's his government. It's his country right now. I was thinking as it pertains to the emoluments clause of that press conference he gave about a week before his inauguration, where there were these questions about him and his businesses, and he brought out an attorney, and he had a pile of manila folders, you might remember this, with paper in them. We don't know what was on the paper, if there was anything on the paper. And he said, this is how much paperwork we have to do to separate me from my businesses. Well, he never did it. The thing to do would be to put it in a blind trust. His family is still running the business. There's no question about that. He's never separated himself from his businesses. So when he says the emoluments clause is phony, like all those other examples you listed, he really means it.
And don't forget, Joe, just yesterday, his latest successes, he articulated it in front of the cameras. I captured ISIS. I captured ISIS.
Meanwhile, guys.
By the way,
yeah.
No, I just want to say, by the way, as we talk about ISIS this morning, being reported all over the world, that guess what ISIS is doing now? They are assassinating local leaders. They are consolidating their power in local governments across the region. They are beginning their comeback. They are beginning to rise again. Why? Because, as any military man or woman will tell you, United States man or woman will tell you, ISIS is going to come back. And Willie, the crazy thing is the Pentagon, the IG, issued a report about a month or two ago warning of the coming rise of ISIS. What did Donald Trump do? The one thing that ensured their rise again.
Yes.
ISIS is coming back. And as Lindsey Graham said, and as Republicans have been saying, when they come back, these Republicans say, the blood will be on Donald Trump's hands. Their words, not mine.
And President Trump dug in again yesterday on that decision, defending it even as our troops left the country and the Kurds were pleading for them to stay. We'll talk.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.